Hello and welcome everyone to this Group of 78 webinar on religious soft diplomacy and the United Nations. My name is Roy Culpepper. I chair the Group of 78. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that the city of Ottawa, where I'm making these introductory remarks, is in the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. In Canada, Indigenous communities have for many generations stewarded the rivers, coasts, forest, and the land. And we must learn from their example, join their struggle for justice, and respect their legacy. 4 decades ago, 78 eminent Canadians issued a declaration urging the Prime Minister, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, at the time, and the Government of Canada to emphasize 3 priorities in our foreign policy. 1, work assiduously for the removal of the threat of nuclear war. 2, help mobilize world resources to achieve a more equitable international order and bring an end to crushing poverty. And 3, strengthen the United Nations and other global institutions to foster international cooperation and facilitate the settlement of disputes. The debate fomented by the statement resulted in the eventual formation of the Group of 78, which continues to this day to stimulate discussion and pursue its goals of peace, justice, and planetary survival through webinars, such as today's, and an annual policy conference, which this year will be on adaptation to build resilience in the climate emergency. It's worth noting that 5 of the 78 signatories of the Declaration in 1981 held leadership positions in faith communities, and I'm referring to Donald MacDonald, Robert B. McClure, Alphonsus Penny, E.W. Scott, and Lois Wilson. So with that backdrop, it is particularly apt that the Group of 78 is hosting today's webinar. We're fortunate in having 2 distinguished speakers who are co-editors of a book that is about to be published by Lexington Books, which argues that religious diplomacy is increasingly important for achieving the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. We can consider this webinar as a Canadian book launch of the book. Briefly, our 2 speakers are Sherrie M. Steiner, who is an assistant professor of sociology at Purdue University Fort Wayne. Her research focus is on religious soft power, environmental sociology, and improvement of public health. Jim Christie is also a scholar of religious soft diplomacy, and in addition, he is an ordained minister of the United Church of Canada and an ambassador at large with the Canadian Multi-Faith Federation. Among his many other engagements, Jim is currently chair of the World Federalist Movement Canada and Project Plowshares. Jim is going to begin with some context-setting remarks, and then we'll turn it over to Sherrie to make a slide presentation. So Jim, thank you so much for agreeing to be a speaker, and over to you.
Thank you, Roy. The pleasure is entirely mine, in no small measure, because this is a bit of an anniversary for me as well. It was 25 years ago that I was admitted to membership in the Group of 78, with many of the original cast still very much present and very active. And Lois, who I saw the other day, by the way, is still very much alive and active, somewhere in her 90s. So this 40th anniversary is of significance for me, and I count it a pleasure and a privilege to be able, with Sherrie, to introduce this book of ours to you. In an era of some mixed feeling, both in this country and in a significant number of places in the globe, about the nature of religion. In fact, on that topic, let me begin by setting a bit of context with a short story. About a dozen years ago, when I was still very active in leadership of the Canadian Council of Churches, we hosted Reginald Bibby. Now, some of you may know Reg. He is a sociologist of some repute, a professor at the University of Lethbridge in Alberta, and he particularly focuses on the religious life of Canada, to a degree beyond, but mostly in Canada. Now, considering that Reg is a sociologist of religion, and with no disrespect to my longtime colleague, Dr. Steiner, a sociologist, period, it goes to say something that Reg has a particularly piquant sense of humor. To wit, when he was speaking to the 50-odd members of the governing board of the Canadian Council of Churches, which comprehends probably the widest and deepest regional body of churches in the Christian community of the 9 extant in the world, he was there to talk about, well, nothing less than the state of religion, which he had been documenting for, by that time, several decades. And he said, I have some surprising news for you. Religion is alive and well in Canada. Thank you very much. Reg then paused, turned to me and said, well, not yours, actually. This was somewhat disconcerting. It did engender a certain number of chuckles and even giggles and some guffaws from my colleagues in various denominations, which are doing better, perhaps, than the United Church of Canada as it creeps up to 100 years old. But the key thing, perhaps, is that Reg wanted to point out that Canada, as a pluralistic society, or an increasingly pluralistic society, is far stronger in terms of its religious representation than it had been when we were more or less, I use the term guardedly, a Christian nation, if really we ever were. Now, it would be fair to say that Christianity in all its incarnations, but certainly the Protestant form of Christianity in Western Europe and North America, has had a pretty rough couple of centuries. And interestingly enough, a large part of the hard time that church communities, Christian communities, have suffered really can be attributed to the church's, well, let's not be coy, the church's own fault. I'm not going to mention a whole stack of books during the course of this brief introduction, but there is one that I think is both worth mentioning and extremely important. It's by A.N. Wilson, who is an historian, a biographer, at one time the literary editor of the London Times. He wrote a book towards the end of the last century, beginning of this, that was entitled God's Funeral. The title itself being taken from the poem of the same name by T.H. Hardy at the end of the 19th century. And in God's Funeral, really, he documents in a form that is accessible and knowledgeable. One of Wilson's reviewers has said he's incapable of writing a dull sentence, and I commend the book to you enormously. What he actually does is document how the Christian church managed to lose most of its intellectual vigor during the course of the 19th century, how it essentially drove from its midst progressive thinkers, and progressive thinkers in both theology, philosophy, and as well progressive thinkers in the sciences, hoping, it seemed, that the church might, through sheer force of years behind it and numbers, be able to freeze frame the world as it was. And of course, that didn't happen. The world moved on, and the progressive thought in the world moved on, and in many instances, Christian churches across Europe and in North America were left behind. It's a fascinating chronicle and well worth looking at. But it's Wilson who documents my contention that the church really, as that rather embarrassing hunting statement goes, shot itself in the foot for the better part of 100 years. The 20th century, of course, was even worse, not only for Protestant Christianity in the West, but for churches everywhere in the world. By the beginning of the First World War, and this is the second book that I will mention, unless I mention Sherrie's first book, which is excellent, perhaps in a moment. The First World War was documented in a very fresh way in 1914 by Philip Jenkins, a scholar in the United States, who wrote a book entitled The Great and Holy War, how World War I became a religious crusade. And the essential note that I want to take from that book is his documenting of the appalling manner in which so-called Christian leaders on both sides of the conflict from 1914 to 1918 did everything they could to be as partisan as they possibly could and to demonize with extraordinary effectiveness those persons on the other side of the conflict, as it were. It was a set piece for the balance of the century. We don't need to go into all of the nightmares of the years between 1901 or even 1914 and 2001, but save to note that the Shoah, the massacre of European Jewry, of the people called or designated as Roma and Sinti, the subsequent years which led to the genocide in Rwanda, where Christians on both sides of the conflict, as Romeo Dallaire so often said, perpetrated extraordinary up-close and personal massacres with machete of each other, of people being tucked into churches and set alight, not perhaps an unusual thing in Christian history, but there's very little glory that can be accrued to the Christian church in the 20th century, with the possible exceptions of the Barmen Declaration in 1936, which was the confessing church's condemnation of Adolf Hitler and the entire Nazi project. But it was a grim century for religion as well. And it could be fair to say that many progressives and many intellectuals by the end of the 20th century were convinced that religion was simply going to disappear, rather like a vermiform appendix, which may at one time or another have had a purpose in the human body, but no one at the present time seems to understand what that purpose might have been. On the other hand, by the turn of the 21st century and today, the Pew Research people tell us that 82% of the world's population self-define as, according to one tradition or another, of being religious or a member of a religious community. And that doesn't even begin to include in Canada and certainly the United States and in other parts of the G20 nations, the extraordinary reemergence of the spirituality of Indigenous people. Roy noted at the beginning our presence on traditional lands of Indigenous folk from coast to coast to coast, wherever you might be listening. But it's the spirituality of Indigenous people that shows enormous promise in dealing with how religion might be reinterpreted in the world in which we currently live. And it's no accident that 3 of the contributors to the book are either themselves Indigenous people or who have a voice for Indigenous communities. The world was perhaps about ready to dismiss religion, and then 9/11 happened. And all of a sudden, religion was back with a vengeance, and by and large was seen not simply as being irrelevant, but at the same time malevolent. By 2005, the concern about religion's place in the global community was addressed by Rowan Williams, then Archbishop of Canterbury, and by Jim Wallace, we can only say left-wing and progressive evangelical Christian editor of Sojourner's periodical, with which some of you may well be familiar. Jim and Rowan were convinced that religion need not to be discounted in global affairs, but at the same time that religious communities really needed to feel incumbent upon themselves to develop a new relationship, a new kind of conversation that was neither on the one hand aggressively critical nor on the other hand excessively diffident. The consequence of that was a dozen years of religious leader summits, concurrent more or less with the G8 summit process. And from 2014 to to the autumn of last year, that was morphed into a process of conversation with the G20 nations. To find common ground or common language, we pursued the Rosetta Stone, that common document, if you like, or common tablet historically, that proved to be the Millennium Development Goals articulated by Kofi Annan's Forum in 2000, and subsequently, as of 2015, the Sustainable Development Goals. The history of that I won't even begin to touch on now, save that Dr. Steiner has produced an extraordinary book, and it concerns global or moral responsibility. Sherrie? Nope, you're muted, and I managed to bungle the name.
Moral Pressure for Responsible Globalization. Doesn't
that sound like a great name? It's a great book. I commend that to you as well. But it's also a terrific way to be able to introduce Sherrie's section of the presentation. Sherrie and I have been sometime colleagues and friends since the latter years of the first decade of this century. And this particular project, and we may speak more about how it came to be later, is a product of her imagination and, in large measure, the happy convergence of those colleagues of mine across the world who were willing to take part in this entire project. Sherrie, I hope that hasn't set too much context or taken too much time, but I'm delighted now to turn the virtual podium over to you.
Well, thank you, Jim. Thank you. This is great. And thank you to the group of 78. It's a pleasure to be with you today. And we appreciate your making discussion of our volume part of your program. I want to focus my introductory comments on putting the book into the broader context of religious diplomacy and global governance. The book itself begins by drawing parallels between two artistic interpretations of Revelation chapter 3, verse 20, which says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with that person and they with me." One artistic representation is an 1853 painting by William Holman Hunt that hangs inside Keble College in Oxford, shown here on the right. God is the stranger knocking on the door with no handle of the place where we reside as home. The other is the Prince of Peace poster by Harry Anderson, where Jesus is knocking on the door of the United Nations building. Religion is pictured as the outsider to global governance, the stranger requesting admittance. Harry Anderson was a Seventh-day Adventist illustrator who did most of his illustrations in the early 1900s prior to the rise of the global interfaith movement. Were he drawing the picture today, he might have been more inclusive with his illustrations, presuming a multi-faith perspective. The presenting query in both of these images is, will those inside practice hospitality? Will they trust the outside stranger just enough to let them enter their abode to commune? It merits mentioning that this is not a militaristic image. The stranger is not even asking to move in for an extended stay. The imagery is one of a sojourner making a sacred association between hospitality and community. But there is risk involved, and opening the door involves some degree of trust, even if just a little bit for a short time. At the turn of the century, the door of the United Nations began to crack open. Guidance mechanisms were put into place to help UN agencies navigate the diverse world of religious groups as a risk reduction measure, so that secular sensibilities, as well as intra-religious sensibilities, could both be taken into account when forming collaborative partnerships. Aza Karam, who helped write the guidance book during her time at the United Nations, explains why these protocols are necessary and valuable in Chapter 1 of the edited volume. We appreciate what she has to say, which is why our recommendations are intended to offset the limitations associated with current practices, not replace them. In Chapter 2 of our volume, I discuss the limitations of this current approach in terms of worldview struggles. The worldview struggles in international relations has been described by Brett Sharks as a world-defining context between monism and dualism. Monism is a worldview that attributes oneness or singleness of existence, where the world is viewed as a seamless web. Defenders of dualism oppose monism for its inclination toward various types of statism that emphasize the state's monopoly on legal power. U.S. notions of freedom and human rights are deeply rooted in the separation that these reified categories socially construct. The United Nations was built upon a dualistic worldview. In addition to notions like freedom and human rights, dualistic worldviews tend to support science, bureaucratic administration, technological innovation, and instrumental social action. But dualism also has serious shortcomings that are relevant to governing the environmental disruptions that will continue to increase in the years ahead. Dualistic categorization tends to promote scientific closure that sets items aside as problem solved in ways that may be inadequately responsive to ongoing disruptions that at times may become exponential. Consider, for example, how India celebrated their control of the virus and figured that the problem was solved, only to unexpectedly suffer from a resurgence that has become an apocalyptic nightmare. We risk becoming prisoners of our own perspectives, say critics of dualism. And how the dualism plays out with respect to UN engagement with religion, UN agencies are advised, for example, to reduce the risk to UNDP reputation to only engage with faith-based organizations and religious leaders that have expertise in interfaith dialogue. UNDP personnel, for example, are discouraged from engaging with faith-based organizations and religious leaders who discriminate against members of other faiths and those they consider irreligious, who engage in stigma and discrimination, who exploit vulnerable groups, who disregard women's rights or support gender inequality, who connect with violent extremist groups, or who have a closed organizational and governance structure. In other words, UN agencies are encouraged to manage the public problem of religion. While recognizing that UN agencies need to protect their objectives of upholding human rights, empowering women, and managing their engagement portfolio in accordance with diversity, so they create politically neutral platforms for secular entities to engage the faith sector. With this attitude, how are they ever going to listen to faith-based voices of dissent? If the public voice of religion are a presence to be managed, how will they ever listen to faith-based criticisms of how they govern? The call for UN reform is not new, but the UN was built on the premise that the alternative of monism is not well suited for governing diverse communities and vulnerable populations. So if dualism is important to preserve and maintain, how can its shortcomings be addressed? Recent events have highlighted that religion and politics are a dangerous mix. This photo illustrates how a political force in the United States continues to use religion for political gain. Ensuring that a political engagement portfolio is diverse does not guarantee that power will be evenly distributed. As a sociologist, I like to highlight the importance of social organization. And many times social theory, when it thinks about religion, is not really looking at the diverse forms religion takes within society. For example, if you're familiar with Karl Marx, when he talked about religion being the opiate of the people, he was talking about religious monopolies, the dominant religion in a society. He ignored the impact of religious minorities. When Max Weber wrote The Protestant Ethic in the Spirit of Capitalism, he was not writing about the dominant religion, Anglicanism. He focused on how a religious minority, the Puritans in this case, catalyzed social change for late feudalism to become capitalism. When we talk about religion and religious diplomacy, what is the socially organized form that the religious group takes? Many of the UN partners are monopolies somewhere. Jeffrey Haynes has documented an engagement bias by UN agencies. He says that between 58 and 75% of the faith-based organizations registered with the UN EcoSoc are North-based and Christian. Muslim engagement is significantly underrepresented, but the UN Alliance of Civilizations and the OIC countries have a significant Islamic presence that enters the dialogue at that point. The voices that are missed the most are those faith groups that are minority religions everywhere. Groups like African Methodist Episcopal churches, Seventh-day Adventists, Mennonites, Indigenous peoples, etc. These are the voices represented in this volume, the minorities that are minorities everywhere. Now that we've talked a bit about who is still outside knocking on the door to be let in, I want to say a few words about why this is important for governance. Voices of religious dissent, the groups that dare criticize the way in which governments govern, are often minorities everywhere. Democratic regimes have recognized, at least in theory, that those voices need protection, so they find ways to build into governance democratic processes such as the separation of powers, accountability, and freedom of the press. At the world level, however, there is no government to establish these processes. There's only governance without government. So how do we move the global governance toward democracy so that the voices of the minorities of minorities might be preserved? For this, we turned to the evolution of loyal opposition in the British parliamentary system, which Keith Best details in Chapter 3. Unlike the United States, which built its democratic system upon a constitutional document, the United Kingdom moved into democracy through dialogue. It was, excuse me, and continues to be a rather raucous discussion along a rocky road. But it is a model that we put forward as a conceptual tool to promote more inclusive dialogue. Loyal opposition refers to a protection that was developed to shield the party out of power from being accused of treason. When applied more broadly across different sectors of society, loyal opposition refers to the democratic practice of making space for dissent by identifying ways to knit outsiders into democracy's fabric by attending to institutional dimensions of integration. Loyal opposition creates a structure whereby UN actors are able to engage with those who might otherwise be walled off from collaborative conversation, but again, not for purposes of co-optation to install minority rule, as with current attempts under Trumpism in the United States. Precedent for establishing a loyal opposition was established when all member states of the UN adopted the responsibility to protect as a global political commitment at the 2005 World Summit. State sovereignty is respected, except when there are exceptional circumstances where they must refrain from standing idly by. Here are some of the chapters that illustrate loyal opposition at work. In anthropocentrism, and world religions and the environment. We talk about it in these chapters. We talk about the military-industrial complex in chapters 14 and 17. We talk about secularization and freedom of religion or belief in chapter 5 and 13. Colonialism and indigenous peoples in chapter 8 and 16. Women's empowerment in chapter 10. Minority rule versus democratic inclusion in chapter 6 and 11. Racism and sustainable development. That was sort of an emergent theme that we wove in at different points throughout the book, but we didn't give it a specific chapter all by itself. I think if we were writing it now, we would have. These are the recommendations to the United Nations that flow from our discussion in the book. We recommend a UN Declaration on the Rights of Religious Communities, that a position be established of Deputy High Commissioner for Religion. We recommend adoption of religious leaders' engagement as a normative doctrine in peacekeeping missions. There's a whole chapter on chaplaincy. And we recommend establishment of a multi-faith ombuds team, a team drawn from at least the 7 world religious traditions and indigenous spiritualities. We also make recommendations to religious faith and traditional spiritual communities. Recommendations that religious communities support the UN in accordance with the posture of a loyal opposition. They participate in the UN International Religious Harmony Week, which is an annual event. They develop theologies of diversity and respective traditions. Develop theologies of inclusivity and sacred hospitality to religious minorities in respective traditions. That they adhere to Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a combined set of statements. That they support efforts to democratize the UN via a UN Parliamentary Assembly and participate in the World Religions and Spiritualities UN Religious Roundtable, which also is an annual event. And that concludes my introductory comments at this point. So I'll hand it over to Q&A. Jim, do you have any follow-up comments? I forgot we do that first.
Yeah. I don't really think too many, Sherrie, other than to perhaps note and acknowledge that the question of religion in the public square, whether the public square is national or international, is not a regular topic of conversation within the community of the Group of 78. But we're increasingly aware of how significant the religious issues are domestically, internationally. The number of conflicts that are often attributed to religion, but in the final analysis, deal far more often with questions of nationalisms. And that's one of the challenges that we know we face. It may be impossible to completely distinguish between religion and culture. Certainly, they are often interconnected. I think one of the things that I would like to pick up on just very briefly is, I think, one of the most interesting elements of the book that we come up time and time again, particularly in the chapters by Indigenous persons or those whose voice is related to Indigenous persons, and that is the interplay between the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was promulgated in 1948, and the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The thing that strikes us most with the analogy to religious communities is, again, the challenge that is faced between the individual and the community in virtually every community or every country, frankly, on the planet. And we see the great contribution of the UNDRIP to the United Nations system and the global community as being a way of expressing the needs and the prerogatives of community groups without infringing on the right of individuals. I believe it was certainly Desmond Tutu, when describing Ubuntu in the context of Africa and South Africa in particular, who notes that in the West, our way of functioning essentially is based on the Cartesian principle, I think, therefore I am, whereas Ubuntu is a more holistic approach to life, which suggests we are, therefore I am. And that, particularly from the perspective of religious communities, was important. I think we'd also probably want to acknowledge that one of the realities is that, well, frankly, the book is only about half as long as it needed to be in terms of incorporating worldviews and religions that are not primarily of the principal Abrahamic traditions and Indigenous spirituality, and we know that. Whether we'll ever attempt a second volume is a very huge, outstanding question. But I think actually Roy has said that he would be willing to moderate, and perhaps has a question himself or two that he would like to contribute. So I'm going to be as open as Sherrie is to whatever questions, comments, or critiques you might offer.
Okay, there is a question in the queue, but let me ask a question, if I may, to start off. You refer to the rights of religious minorities, and we see so many examples of persecuted minorities all over the world. When you have to think of the Yazidi in the Middle East, or the Rohingya in Myanmar. But the picture of Donald Trump standing in front of St. John's Church brought to mind the power of the evangelical community in the U.S. and, in fact, across the world. And this is by no means a majority of religious people. It's a very small but well-positioned minority of religious spokespeople. How do you, in your book, account for that end of religious minorities?
Sherrie, I'm going to let you tackle that first, I think.
We try to, throughout the book, talk about thinking about the form that the social organization is taking, and then on behalf of whom governance is occurring. And minority rule is not what democracy is all about. So we talk about minority faith groups and groups that are minorities everywhere versus an attempt of one group to gather enough power to influence governance for the benefits of one group rather than in a democratic, more inclusive approach. So the co-optation is always a risk, but it's, and that's why, I mean, in many ways, the guidance documents that are in existence, and we validate the reasons that those guidance documents exist, is trying to protect government agencies from being co-opted by religious groups. That's a valid consideration, and that's why we emphasize that this is not talking about removing those guidance documents because the concerns are real. But what ends up happening is people lose sight that it's co-optation by religion and government, the mixing of politics that tends to, people forget that religious groups don't have military. It's the political groups that have the military. And when there's a dangerous blending, like what we see with evangelical co-optation of certain political groups in the United States, what they tend to lose sight of is the human rights abuses that are occurring against religious minorities that are an all-time high worldwide. And that's what we're trying to bring attention to, is that the minorities of minorities who don't have military groups, who might want to speak out against the kind of co-optation that you're referring to, are the ones that tend to be silenced. And in global governments, there's no protections of those groups that to allow them to even really speak, yet alone be protected.
Okay, thank you. Jim, did you have some words on this too?
I think given the number of other questions that are coming up, I'd be content to simply go on to some of the others at this stage, Roy.
Okay. Richard Harmston asks, what messages are various religious communities bringing to global governance?
Shall I take a first run at that one, Sherrie?
Sure.
I think it would be important to note that religious groups are as diverse, religious communities are as diverse, of course, as the people that make them up. And there are going to be some religious groups, and let's simply acknowledge this right from the beginning, who abhor the opportunities to learn more about their neighbors and their neighbors' religious communities. We know that that's a fact. Call them extremists, fundamentalists, whatever term you choose to use, that exists. However, we're finding increasingly that goodwill amongst religious and spiritual communities, and we distinguish between that, or at least acknowledge the distinction in no small part because of large world religious groups that see themselves not so much as religious but spiritual, for example, Buddhism, and because of the insights that have come from Indigenous communities who insist that spirituality and religion aren't the same. In the Christian context, they have pretty solid precedents as well, or companionship, more accurately, in the work of people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was hanged at Flossenburg in 1945 for his part, or at least presumed part, in the 1944 attempt on Adolf Hitler's life. So what's being said will vary from community to community. But to go back to a conversation noted in the book between Hans Kung and Peter Zosky in 1984, Kung noted that the 20th century in the long run might not be seen primarily for its wars, its gulag, its genocides, but as the first moment in history when the world's great religions first began to talk to one another. And what has happened is precisely that. Since, well, certainly let's use big numbers. Since 1993, when the second iteration of the Parliament of World Religions began, there have been a whole variety of ways in which world religious communities themselves begin to engage in conversation, sometimes in groups or amalgams of religious traditions, sometimes bilaterally. One of the more moving sites in the late 20th century was in Riva del Garda in Italy, I think in 1984, when a meeting of Religions for Peace gathered together a significant number of world religious communities, large and small. And one of the most celebrated attendants was John Paul II, who was there not as the significant prelate of the Roman Catholic community worldwide, a good, well, what, 1.5 billion people, about 1.5 billion people, but rather as a, if you like, a simple participant who sat in the audience with people of mixed faiths. This was repeated in 2005 at John Paul II's funeral, when the College of Cardinals, looking at the dais in St. Peter's Square, was behind the colonnade that fronts St. Peter's, and on the stage itself, to the viewers left of the catafalque were world religious leaders from not only other branches of the Christian tradition, but from a multiplicity of traditions worldwide. On the right-hand side, from the point of view of the congregation, if you will, were world leaders. It was a significant thing to note that there was in symbol something that most religions have noted for a long time, that if there is a God, then that God is either the God of all of us or simply some sort of mythical tribal deity. In some respects, monotheism is the first attempt at global thinking globally. Now, again, that it's the ways in which each religion comes to that are very different, but the first thing that can be said is that the world religious communities and indigenous spirituality are providing a world view, that we are all one global community. As Rabbi Irvin Shield once said of Christians and Jews, whether we like it or not, we're joined at the hip. Another way of phrasing it is that from the point of view of the theology of much of the world's religions, any war is a civil war, because we are, if you like, our brother's keeper. We share the same moral and ethical principle that we are to do unto others as we would be done unto ourselves. There's extraordinary interconnection amongst the moral and ethical standards of world religions that we're only just beginning really to learn about. But I think I'll just pause there for now, and I think Sherrie has an additional observation. Sherrie?
Yes, in terms of like the messages that various religious communities bring to global governance, one of the sort of characteristics of what we're doing, the current trajectory of where we're headed as a global community, is we're dying. biodiversity loss, climate change, et cetera, where to be unsustainable is to be undermining the necessary conditions of our own existence. So we've got these 17 sustainable development goals, and we want to move in the direction of implementing those, Agenda 2030. But we're still predominantly moving in the direction of still killing ourselves. There's things that are being done, but we still don't have quite the momentum. We're trying, right? Well, part of where religion can come in is that we've got these documents, the Declaration of Human Rights and the UNDRIP. And the reason why we mention the UNDRIP is that human rights can sometimes be going from protection of the right of the individual to individualism. Individual to individualism. And the problem of religion focused on family is it can move in the direction of familism, where you get these fertility cults that have all kinds of gender discrimination. When religion and governance and religion at the UN begin to dialogue, is individualism gets pulled back to talking about the individual, familism gets pulled back to talking about the family. And the rights of religious communities can have this balance that promotes life, sustainability, the affirmation of life without familism, without individualism. There's the blended conversation that becomes possible to help us move in the direction of sustainability. I mean, that's a big picture step back, but in practical impact, people talk about like one of the questions, what practical impact do you see emerging from engagement between religious communities and the UN? It was religious communities that were very influential in adding the anti-human trafficking component, for example, to the Sustainable Development Goals. There's a practical impact in terms of climate change. Jim, did you want to talk about the impact with the nuclear Project Plowshares?
Not perhaps at great length, although the director of Project Plowshare, Cesar Jaramillo, has contributed a chapter to this. In terms of practical examples, maybe we could even take one very brief moment of work from the domestic to the international, given the pandemic, which features prominently in many chapters of the book, which you might expect, given that it was pulled together by its contributors and its editors during the COVID-19 pandemic. Domestically, in January, Dr. Tam, Canada's Chief Medical Officer of Health, was well aware that she was facing considerable interpretive problems with religious communities who, for a variety of reasons, some of them involving religious constraint and custom, some of them involving, particularly with respect to Indigenous people, an essential mistrust of governmental agencies, were developing very significant vaccine resistance. And she invited the key religious, ecumenical, and interfaith organizations to pull together a consultation with her. And over 1,300 religious leaders from coast to coast to coast gathered virtually with Dr. Tam towards the end of January and established what amounts to a kind of two-way conversation. And the result was really quite staggering insofar as Dr. Tam's capacity to get her message out to a resistant community, and in terms of those communities being able to establish a new arena of conversation with, in this country, the federal government. I think by analogy, we can say that there are crises like that that continuously go on that impinge on the UN system and the global religious communities. And whether it is Religions for Peace or whether it is the World Council of Churches, whether it is the various regional councils of churches or religious bodies. There are a number of opportunities that are strategic and that are practical. We've mentioned and still, I think, want to mention again the religious community's engagement with the Indigenous spiritual concepts inherent in the UNDRIP to address, as Sherrie says, in a healthy manner, the tensions between the individual and the community. Environmentally, we take a look at religious understandings, not restricted to Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, that the world is ultimately the home of all of us. And in many of those traditions, a conviction that, if you like to use the biblical language of Judaism and Christianity, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof.
Okay, I think we've responded to Jim Cornelius' question about practical impact. I'm going to go to John Williams, who asks, given the very large number of religious groups in the world, how can the UN decide which ones to dialogue with?
Those are the guidance documents that we talk about in the book, and they exist. They've talked about groups that affirm the principles of human rights that are in the Declaration of Human Rights. Those are the guidance documents, and so our beginning point is to affirm their guidance documents, but the exceptions need to be made because of the patterns of who gets excluded.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. To an extent, the onus is going to be on the religious communities themselves. And that's not a simple process, but precedents again exist. The Canadian Council of Churches adopted almost 25 years ago now, a process called Forum, which is essentially recognizing that in the way in which the world usually works, the biggest community with the largest budgets have the loudest voice. And quite frankly, we felt that there was enough of that was not a healthy way to govern any community. And the Canadian Council of Churches adopted something that we came over the years to call the Forum approach or Forum system. And it simply means that we've agreed constitutionally that size does not matter when it comes to issues of religious understanding and spirituality, that everyone at the table has a voice. So we have some experience of being able to ensure that minority voices speak as though they were the voice of very large religious communities, whether that is Sunni Islam or Roman Catholic Christianity. We've worked at that ourselves and are in a position to engage in dialogue with UN agencies and the entire UN system in a way that will allow a substantial amount of credibility and of inclusivity, not by any means to a degree that perhaps is anything close to what it might be, but enough to begin very solidly.
Okay, Doug Roche, if I can go to him, asks, how do you see social justice values expressed on a UN agenda without being explicitly religious?
Thanks for that question, Doug. That's one that, of course, is not an unusual one in any arena, international or national. I think in this case, we'd have to say that the way in which we've approached it thus far is to employ first the Millennium Development Goals and then the Sustainable Development Goals. From the point of view of religious communities, neither of those two collections of aspirational ambitions are anything like perfect, anything like adequately comprehensive. But they give us a common ground to talk about. The G8 and subsequently G20 communities and ultimately the United Nations know what they are. They've emerged out of those systems. They are in language that is comprehensible to both religious groups and secular political groups. The language is not in and of itself religious or even spiritual, and yet there is not a single one of the MDGs or SDGs that is not within one or another religious tradition, not understood to be spiritual or religious. Call them values, in some cases articles of faith. And that's the way we've been proceeding with surprising success. To give you an example tangibly, many of you will perhaps know John Curtin of the Monk School of International Affairs in Toronto. John, going back to 2008, I believe, and his team have been documenting, insofar as they are able, the impact that first the G8 religious leaders summits and then the Interfaith G20 Interfaith Forum Association has had on the agenda of the G20. And John's bottom line observation is that there has been an impact in two ways. The first is that he is convinced, based on the research they've undertaken, that compliance with first the MDGs and the SDGs is higher than hitherto with the engagement with religious communities. And secondly, that there has been not even an indication that the SDGs might slip off the agenda of first the G8 and now the G20, and that he has credited with the presence of the world religious communities and indigenous spiritualities increasingly with the leadership of the G8 and G20. We believe by analogy the same thing can occur with the United Nations system itself.
Okay, I think we've run out of questions. Maybe I can ask another question and then we can wind up. Is that all right?
Absolutely.
You frame a lot of your book around the centrality of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is totally understandable. I'm wondering why you don't give equal pride of place to the Paris Agreement and the climate change dialogue that has been built around that, because that's perhaps, along with the nuclear issue, the most existential threat facing mankind today.
Well, I would say, and then turn it over to Sherrie, that it's simply the comprehensive nature of the SDGs. You're absolutely right. The nuclear issue and the climate issue are perhaps the two most egregious facing us, unless we consider the contained and uncontrolled population growth as a close third, and it impinges, of course, on the first two as well, certainly on the climate issues. But Sherrie, would you like to wrap up with this one, because it's your area of particular expertise?
Well, it's certainly included in the Sustainable Development Goals. To have it be the singular conversation like that, I think we would be talking about then the interfaith engagement with the COP. This year would be the COP26, and there is a COP26 interfaith engagement group. We struggle with the Interfaith Forum. Italy is hosting both the G20 this year, and they're partnering with UK in a track for COP26. But the processes are in many ways involving different sets of people, and trying to build an interfaith bridge to have conversations with both. We're somewhat mirroring the structure that exists in transnational relations that have different pathways for engaging those.
Yeah.
Not to say it's not important, it's extremely important.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Roy, just before you conclude, I know Doug's got a question about how not to break the bank on the cost of the book.
Right.
And that's always a great frustration with any book that purports to be available primarily for academic circles. And gee, by the way, Doug, I loved your book and was glad it didn't cost $120 US. But two things to note. First, Sarah has included in the chat, and I believe may be willing to circulate the flyer that has the discount code, which is 30% off the book, but there's also an electronic version which is dramatically less costly. Sherrie, do you remember what that is? It's something along the lines of hardback in Canada, I think, though it is electronic, and that's not to everyone's taste.
The book, I don't remember the exact price on it, I'm sorry.
But there is an electronic version, and that's substantially less, Doug.
Okay, maybe we can round up that information and make it available to those who are interested in getting the ebook.
Absolutely.
Well, unless there's any final observations by either of you, are there?
I just want to add that the Sustainable Development Goals is a whole of governance approach.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay.
I think all I would want to add, Roy, is that after a couple of hundred very bad years of religion and attempts to develop modern governance, we're looking at a new day and a new possibility, but very much just the beginning. You know, we've only been at this at the outside since 1893 with the first iteration of the Parliament of World Religions. And really, that was so swiftly lost in the sequential trauma and tragedy of the 20th century that I think it would be fair to say that we've really only been at this serious business of interfaith work since the 1980s. And the impact is going to be, well, it's not going to be assessed until long after I'm spilling ink on the subject.
Okay, here's the last question, which I was actually tempted to pose myself. It's from Deborah Parks, who wonders whether these interfaith dialogues couldn't also include individuals who do not follow any religion but secular ethics. What happens to the atheists in
well, as a matter of fact, Deborah, let me give you one quick and dirty answer to that in terms of Canada. And quick and dirty, of course, is just an expression that we use. But the quick answer is that the Canadian Interfaith Conversation, which itself was formed out of the hosting here in Canada by Dr. Axworthy at the University of Winnipeg in 2010 of the G8 Religious Leaders Summit, issued in the establishment of the Canadian Interfaith Conversation. And since 2013, every other year, the Canadian Interfaith Conversation in particular holds or supports what is called our whole society. Our whole society has been convened in Montreal, British Columbia, Toronto, Ottawa, most recently in Winnipeg. And its purpose is to bring our whole society together, including humanist organizations, and persons of faith and persons of frankly, no particular faith at all, which is in many iterations of interfaith dialogue now pretty standard. We rarely insist, even though it can create some problems, that persons who have not a religious viewpoint are unwelcome. It always changes the nature of the conversation, granted, but quite often that conversation is improved in quality precisely because of the presence of those who are skeptical or resistant, at least, to anything that might be considered an organized religious or spiritual community.
Thank you. Sherrie, you had some thoughts on this as well.
Well, usually we say religion or belief, but it's not just about ethics. It's also about, because that's another follow-up that Deborah Parks has, because we're talking about people's ways of life. There's things like buildings and building management and religious rituals and burial practices. It's a way of life that it's not just about the ethics. It's also about a way of life. So I don't think changing it to a Canadian ethical conversation would be able to grapple with things like, right, but religion or belief supposes a fixed belief as to how things are or should be. It's not the same, yeah. And that's why we have the conversations, you know. That's good.
Okay, I think we should bring things to an end. It's quite obvious we could have gone on, but it illustrates that you've opened the door to a lot of very interesting questions that deserve further reflection and research and analysis, and connecting the religious perspective to those of global governance and global justice and global survival. In fact, those are enormously crucial and important to our existence as a species on this planet. and to the quality of life, even if we do continue to survive. So I'd like to thank both of you. Well, Sherrie, you had some.
I'm sorry. A lot of times religious groups have been hesitant to engage in dialogue because they feel like to talk with the other compromises the distinct uniqueness of where they're coming from. And one of the things that interfaith conversation and conversation of people of diverse beliefs that we emphasize is similarity and difference. That to connect with someone that is different from me doesn't mean I abandon the difference of who I am. Mm-hmm. And so I just wanted to add that as the last bit. So sorry. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much again to both of you. Thank you to all of our participants for your questions and your commentary. And last but not least, thank you to Sarah Bowles, who's been running things from our control room at the back and making this webinar another enormous success. So good luck to all and stay safe.
Thank you, Roy and Sarah. Sherrie, always a pleasure.
Thank you all.
Bye, friends.